Having finished the part about collecting and analyzing the first-hand data, so the data, primary data, the data that you collect on your own, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the secondary data, so how we use them. It is a very small topic compared to the previous ones, and we are not going in details of the analysis, because, for example, the analysis methods will not substantially differ from what we covered about the primary data. However, how we make use of it will be somewhat different depending on your specific project. So, what kind of secondary data we have the chance to work with, what is there, what can be important, meaningful, and such. And so this is partly about where it is coming from, and also what is the origin of that stuff that we are working with. So one possible use, so one of the important questions is what you want to use it for. Is it going to be your main data source, or is it going to be a supplement to your primary data? In all the doctoral projects that I have seen so far, it was about supplementing the primary data with some sort of secondary data, and that's a very reasonable purpose and can work very well. At the moment, I actually have a doctoral student who is using secondary data as the main data source. It very rarely happens because obviously when you do the doctoral research, you need to kind of show that you know how to engage in the whole problem solving, and that means that you also need to show that you know how to do data collection. However, she does that. What she does is she's supplementing her main data source, which is secondary data, with some interviews and such. So the whole story behind this is that I have this doctoral student together with Mark, who is looking at the Doctors Without Borders. And what we were really interested is how obviously the procedures are established in the boardroom, and then they need to be followed by the doctors who are in the field. The field never complies with how it was imagined in the boardroom. Therefore, procedures break down, and some new stories are born about how the doctors were actually handling the real situations instead of how it was prescribed. Now, these stories will somehow end up back in the boardroom, and they will influence how the new procedures are created. So there are stories in the boardroom and stories in the field, and they are somehow influencing each other, and this is what we are interested. So what these stories are in the field, how they end up in the boardroom, how they influence the decisions in the boardroom, how they end up embedded in new procedures, then how those procedures are followed and such. There were some very interesting stories elsewhere as well. So, for example, I found a New York Times article where there were a few doctors who, during the Hurricane Katrina, they made certain decisions that they knew that they might actually go to the jail for. So they had very precise procedures on how to prioritize who they are trying to save. And they said that the procedure was wrong, that in that particular situation, if they followed the procedures, they would manage to save much fewer people, and they wanted to save more people, and therefore they abandoned the procedures, knowing at the moment when they did that they may go to jail for that. And they did not, so they did go through the court, so they did get the charges, and the charges were dropped. It was decided that they have done the right thing. And but imagine what kind of pressure you are working with. In addition, your life being threatened, trying to save lives, and then even this is over your head. And this was one of the prompts. So this was all in the background as we started to get interested in these things. And of course, we could not send Megan to the field, not only because she had a baby in the meantime, but also because it is dangerous and expensive to get that done. So the idea was that we will somehow get to those doctors when they are back from the field to tell their own stories as well as they remember them. And then, as Megan was doing a lot of work around this area, she at once came across an incredibly rich archive that someone has actually written up a very large number of stories from the field. There is actually an archivist working full-time for the Doctors Without Borders, and she wrote up all these stories, incredibly, these thousands of pages of text, literally thousands of pages, and incredibly rich accounts. And for example, the first one that Megan started to read was from Rwanda, when there was a genocide, and it was terrible. So the accounts of these doctors were incredibly emotional. They were blaming themselves that they did not actually recognize that there was a genocide going on. It was so alien to their thinking. They could not imagine anything like that happening. And therefore, although it was happening under their nose, they did not realize that it was happening. And then once they recognized it, they obviously started to ring all sorts of alarms. And they were the ones who started to demand a military response to stop the genocide. And this is contrary to the foundations of the Doctors Without Borders. There were some doctors who quit because they believed that the Doctors Without Borders should be like that, but they were not able to put up with it. They had to do something about that, and they started to shout about demanding military response. So when Megan read to me something through Skype about these accounts, even I started crying because it was such incredible description. It was all using the voice of these doctors, how they experienced it. So they were interviewed in great detail and so on. And the additional advantage of this specific data source was that it was all the interviews and the writing up was done by one single person. Yes, over 20-30 years, but it was one single person. So there was this comparability thing because of that nature of the source. So how she got this? I mean, how Megan got this data source? She was just researching her topic and she stumbled upon this. So it is, and once she found it and she started reading it, and she told us about that, we said that, you know, Megan, you will probably have the first PhD where the main data source is an archive, a secondary data, because it is just too good to let go. And now she is very close to submitting her dissertation, and this is her main data source, and hopefully she will also manage to interview the person who wrote up all these accounts. So the big next question is where these secondary data are coming from. So this can be various documents of different organizations, something that you are interested in, that you're studying, and so on. But it can also be some sort of survey that was conducted by someone else for some other purpose. Now then, it is obviously a big question how reliable that is. Was it, I don't know, a census, when you can say that it is not necessarily, doesn't need to be partial? Was it, I don't know, for example, like one of these big consulting agencies, like for example, EY ran a very large sample study recently. well, like 2 years ago, about what CEOs think about the importance of data for their decision making. And they asked, I think, everyone in the Fortune 1000, so all the CEOs in the Fortune 1000 and most of the other C-level executives as well. So they had an incredibly big study. However, they obviously have an agenda. So how that agenda influences the research and the outcome of this research, because what the response you get is depends on how you ask the question. So as they ask the question, as I described it, obviously almost all the CEOs said that data should play a very important role in their decision making. Now, based on that, the guys from EY drew the conclusion, and it was that finally we can get rid of the whole intuition stuff, and all decisions will be data driven, and this is thanks to the big data. Obviously, they are selling what they can provide, and this is why they are approaching this way, because this conclusion has absolutely nothing to do with what the CEOs they asked actually said. I am sure that what they meant, or many of them at least, what they meant, they said that 81% was saying that data is very important and it should be at heart of decision making. So we need both. Yes, of course, we need all the data we can get processed fast and on time and delivered in the format that can inform our decision. And we need the intuition of the decision maker at the same time, and the two together will be working for good decisions. So, what sort of? Oh yes, and you have you can also have academic studies where you can use either their data or their findings, and I will tell you a little bit more about that in the next slide. So obviously you have all sorts of quality and reliability issues. If you have these kind of objections, as I described about the EY study, it does not mean that you cannot use it. Just be careful what to use it for. If you use it, for example, for signifying how important data is today in the whole decision making, that works well, because that is perfectly in line with what the CEOs said. However, if you want to use the conclusion by EY, that's a little bit less easy to justify. Obviously, it depends on your examiner. If I was your examiner, that would be the end of you if you use that kind of finding. So then obviously there are all sorts of data access problems. If you think about this archive that Megan has found, that is almost impossible to find. So she was not looking for it. In order to look for something, you need to know or assume that it may exist. And therefore it is very difficult to find it. Sometimes some of these are astonishingly expensive. So for example, there are these specialized companies like Gartner. Gartner does all sorts of IT evaluations, and they put them always in these what they call Gartner Magic Quadrants, and which company is doing how well according to which criteria. They have very long reports where they explain the criteria on how it was implemented. So it is a very decently done thing, and very good quality stuff, because you can see everything, how it was collected, what inferences were made, how everything was judged, evaluated, and so on. So it is very good quality stuff, but it is crazy expensive. So what you can do? Well, if you, for example, get a kind of the quick glimpse from Gartner saying that, I don't know, Dropbox won the document sharing I don't know, number 1 in the Magic Quadrant, then you go to Dropbox, because it is plausible that Dropbox would buy that report, not only at the level how you would buy it to use it for your research, but to be able to distribute it for free. Many have done that before. When, I don't know, SAP was named the best ERP system, then SAP paid for that report so that it can be made available to everyone for free. Okay, so obviously it was in their best interest because they were the winners. So many of these reports can actually be obtained. So sometimes you just need to be clever about that. So the less obvious but very important issue is really whether you can have access to the methods of how the data was collected, how it was coded, classified, analyzed, or whatever, and whether that is aligned with what you want to do. But for example, with this kind of Gartner, this would be worse. So very slippery thing, very many traps in which you can fall, but it can be extremely useful in some cases. Now, the next is what I wanted to expand a little bit on this aspect on what happens if you use academic publications as the source of what you are working with. So in this case, you need to look at, for example, those who did that research. Is there a fit of paradigm? Is there a fit of terminology? So do they use the terms the same way? Now, this you need to look at in 2 different levels. One is between those that you want to use. So do they talk about the same things? Do they look at the same phenomena? Do they look at the same phenomena the same way? So are they sufficiently close in terms of paradigms? If they are not in the same paradigm, it does not mean that you necessarily need to throw it away. It means that you need to take that into consideration as well. So the first part is what you will use from these academic papers, the data or the findings or both. We have done, and that is also something that I uploaded to the Moodle page. So you can use both very often. First of all, many journals encourage today that you also publish the data, and in that, if you do that, then others can see it as well. In most cases, I encourage people not to do it, especially my doctoral students, because most of the time it is data that is difficult to obtain. And, you know, if someone tells me to make available the interviews with the Nobel laureates to other researchers to try to analyze it, I will say, you know what, if you want to do that, then you get your own work, get access to those Nobel laureates, talk to them, interview them, and then you will find what you can find from those interviews that you can conduct. But you are not getting my interviews. It is partly also a big ethical issue for me, because I promised those people that it is only for my eyes and my co-researchers' eyes, so I don't have the right to give it away. However, many times the data is of the kind that is kind of, let's say, trivially collected, in which case it might be a useful thing for you to publish the data. So, for example, survey data is very often worth publishing because it also advertises your survey. And it might happen that someone else is going to use the same survey in a different population, then they compare what they have found with what you have found, and that can be also kind of building the legacy of your research. Now, if you use the data from previous academic studies and you do exactly the same analysis on the same data, this is called retesting. And you might think that this is a waste of time. It is not. We had the the CEO of Nature Springer, the former CEO of the Nature journal, not CEO, former editor-in-chief of the Nature journal, who said that they actually went back just for fun a little bit to redo some of the experiments from the 60s, 70s, and they have seen that a large number of them failed. So they actually started to attempt a large-scale retesting, and they found that about 2/3 of the experimental work is not actually producing the results that the authors indicated in their papers. Now, whether it was cheating, whether it was sloppiness, I don't know, but it certainly sounds terrible. So doing the retesting, just kind of checking whether it worked in experimental settings or in settings which have this kind of very rigorous and very one type of meaning type work, calculations and such, that might be actually a good idea. Another approach for increasing the robustness of previous studies is if you use the same data and you process it with a different method. If your findings are close enough to the original ones, then it increases the reliability both of your and the other study. That's called triangulation, because you are kind of doing it with a different method only. Then you have something that we have done previously, and I also got you a paper on that. It is called meta-analysis. That is when you use the findings of other papers as input to your paper. This is the most tricky one in terms of paradigmatic and methodological issues. So you need to figure out all the compatibility stuff from all those things that you are looking at. What we were doing was actually a little bit easier in that particular aspect, because it was journal papers, but also practitioner magazine articles, where we used some of the data that they used. So basically, these were all based on interviews with top chefs. So we used those words of the top chefs that these articles produced. We also used the findings, the opinions of those writers, especially that we also used the opinions of people in those practitioner magazines. So where we had a very important justification issue is to show that those people, that those articles that we used, that it is written by experts, so that their opinion should actually count as a meaningful input for our analysis. But it was working quite well. Then there is a related approach which is called meta-synthesis, and this is kind of the next logical step after the meta-analysis, so that you also do synthesis, not only analysis. But the distinction is quite unclear. So we, for example, use the term meta-synthesis for what we did, because we have synthesized what was out there, and our reviewers were kind of unhappy about that, and they were saying that, well, but analysis does involve synthesis, and we did not agree with that, of course, but it does not really make a huge difference how you use one label. So I don't even remember what we did at the end, but there was this sort of disagreement. So this is a very rare type of article. Very few are written this way, but it can be a very useful thing. For example, if you look at how the understanding of a certain concept changed over time, or if you look at what are the important things that are studied around, for example, decision making or creative problem solving and such. So there are a few areas where meta-analysis can be very important and very useful. And another thing is when you can, example, use the how we did to use we created a model based on 2 papers, using the 2 papers as 2 dimensions of a little model, and that ended up in a kind of, let's say, a table 3 by 3, which we then populated using these other journal and magazine papers as data. So basically, who said what fits in which sort of role and that kind of thing. So it was actually quite a bit of fun, and it was leading to a new kind of model. Now, finally, when you what should you pay attention to, how you should be working when you are working with secondary data. So obviously you are not collecting the secondary data, that's why it is called secondary data. So what you need to do with it, so you need to find it. Sometimes it is stumbling upon it, sometimes it is specifically searching for it. If you think about these specific examples that I used, that is more, the first one is about stumbling upon, the second was a very thorough search in the literature. And getting it may not be sometimes trivial, but sometimes it can be, especially if you do some sort of meta-analysis. If your research is located within an organization, it would be a nonsense not to do this, okay? Because you will definitely have access to organizational documents, and those documents can certainly help you understand the phenomenon at hand better. So, for example, it is not feasible for you to do a few-year-long longitudinal study because you don't want to spend that much time on your PhD. However, from these documents, you might see the historic background of, for example, how something developed. So basically, the secondary data can provide you with data that is longitudinal. If you process it that way, that can tell you how certain phenomenon developed that you are studying at the moment. And of course, the story of the phenomenon adds a huge richness to the how you are studying at this time. And of course, all sorts of documents can provide rich contextual information, which can help you understand your interviews, your observations better, or even to make sense of your surveys better. So how do you or why do you would you want to include it? Obviously, in the part of the reasons is the richness that it can add, but the other side is that you can also make it a better or more interesting methodological case, so that you can use mixed methods or multi-methods simply because you are using multiple sources of data. And of course, you can increase the reliability of your primary data, so you can sometimes fact check some things that your interviewees say against the documents in the organization. And of course, your whole research process can become more robust if you are doing this stuff well. So the difficult thing is that you might need a little bit of a different kind of approach in terms of the methodological sense. So not in terms of methods of analysis specifically, but how you get there would be more about that. And it means that it would be about, for example, some kind of hermeneutics. If you go back to the first semester's material, when I talked about the paradigms, one of the interpretivist paradigms was hermeneutics beside phenomenology. And hermeneutics is about basically based on the view that every object, every artifact tells a story. So you might need to look at those things that you use as secondary data with these eyes. And then, of course, you need to figure out how that integrates with the approach that you previously adopted. So it might take some fiddling to bring all these things together, but it is sometimes worth doing. In my view, generally, it is it is very important that we make good use of the secondary data that is readily available anyway, so that we don't need to make a huge extra effort to obtain and such, simply to enrich, to cross-check, to make more robust the research that we are doing. It is not necessarily always worth going out of your way to obtain incredible amounts of this sort of secondary data, but you make use of what is easy to obtain is definitely useful.